Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants from around the globe. Welcome to today's DevX webinar sponsored by Girl Effect, where we're asking the question, can digital interventions influence behavior change? I'm Adva Saldinger, an associate editor here at DevX, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check to make sure everyone can hear me okay. If you can hear me, please type yes into the chat box. Great. Looks like you guys can hear me. So we'll jump right in. As global development professionals across all sectors work to adapt their work to a digital era, DevX has partnered with creative nonprofit Girl Effect to take a closer look at how digital interventions and safeguarding can help enhance your impact. Today's webinar is the first in a two-part series exploring this topic. Be sure to join us for the second part of this series next week on May 30th. Digital platforms and communication tools have transformed the way we seek information and interact with others. Organizations are utilizing the power of digital products to deliver impactful messages and influence positive change in both online and offline communities. In this first webinar, Girl Effect and social science think tank New Knowledge will explore pressing questions like, what is the best practice for digital communications to influence behavior change? How can digital communications bridge the gap between increasing knowledge and shifting attitudes and behaviors? What combination of content formats can best deliver on behavior change? During the webinar, we'll be live tweeting from @DevX. Our Twitter hashtag for this and other DevX webinars is #DevXLive. If you want to interact with others listening to this webinar, then just use that hashtag. Again, that's #DevXLive. We'll look out for your tweets and retweet them, so do join the conversation online. Today I'm joined by Casey Berterman, who's the Technical Director for Digital Research and Learning at Girl Effect, and John Frazier, the President and CEO of New Knowledge. We're delighted to be able to draw on Casey and John's expertise during today's webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Casey and John to tell us more about their work and latest research. Then we'll have plenty of time to answer your questions. You'll be able to enter questions using the chat box in the Ready Talk window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. I'll be keeping track of your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as time allows. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please send a message through the chat box, and one of my colleagues will assist you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Casey and John.
Thank you so much, Adva. So at Girl Effect, we build youth brands and mobile platforms to empower girls and to change their lives. And Girl Effect is increasingly using digital to empower and inspire change amongst girls, because we know that around the world, more and more people have a phone in their hands, and they're looking to digital to ask questions, find information, and really connect with others. So as we started to launch our own digital platforms, we wanted to learn what kind of change we could really expect to see as a result of girls engaging. Was it just knowledge change, attitude change, behavior change? To that end, we partnered with New Knowledge in order to explore current research on behavioral change processes, and we asked them to pay specific attention to the context of digital trends and opportunities. So we started with some really big questions, and we started with asking New Knowledge to develop a literature review that would cover several big core areas. The first area that we really wanted to learn about was around the theories and models of behavior change, just to set the scene and to remind ourselves of what the current theory around behavior change was. And to that end, we developed several learning questions that were related to what is the knowledge gap in behavior change literature, and what is the interplay between behavior change and choice and social norms.
So I'm going to jump in here. Thanks, Casey, for that setup. The role of social media in the lives of young people is changing rapidly, and I think everyone on this call is probably aware of that. But it doesn't mean that our brains are fundamentally different. We're just starting to learn how social media is working now that we've had a good 10 years of consistency in the research. So researchers in our field recognize that we need to systematically identify the individual and contextual factors that impact the efficacy of a digital intervention so that we can test and potentially modify our existing theoretical models that were developed before social media emerged in the lives of teens. When we talk about behavior change, we often think about each person making a change in their life or creating rules that everyone has to follow because we want to police something we might disagree with or wish happened differently. Certainly for those of us like me who grew up without today's smartphones and online connectivity, we might misperceive the scale of use by young people who were raised with that technology and assume it's bad. But really, it's not different. Film, radio, and television were all thought to be corrupting forces in society when they first emerged. But really, it's just a different way that we're processing information. And the good theories of behavior change that have been developed before the advent of digital experiences really can be adapted to explain how digital connectivity is part of how we think and choose to behave. So some of the folks on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with some well-known theories of behavior change. For example, the trans-theoretical model is a fairly common one. The theory of planned behavior, also another common theory we've looked at for years. And more recently, the Nobel Prize was awarded for nudge theory developed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. There's certainly many more, but all of these theories focus on how an individual becomes aware of a change, thinks about that change, and contemplates the ability to go further. Quite simply, if we're doing something that needs to change, we first have to think about it. We have to know what we can do and anticipate what will happen. We experiment with whether it's going to work and then decide based on the feedback if we're going to continue with the behavior. Now that's all pretty simple. It's attached to the person. But social media doesn't change these mental processes. But the research does show that social media can certainly introduce new ideas that might not have been commonly discussed in a community. It might create a new idea that we haven't seen before or give us opportunities that historically didn't occur. Social media can allow a girl, for example, to look for the answer to a question on her phone that she might have been afraid to mention to someone she knows. Which brings us to the question of context. Now, I'm a conservation psychologist by training, and I've been studying what's called collective identity for the past 15 years. Collective identity is the study of how we define ourselves by the groups we belong to. For teens, they're developing the cognitive tools, the ways of thinking about themselves in groups, whether that's the family, which they've known from when they were born, or their circle of friends, their faith community, schools, or clubs. What we know about behavior change is that it's socially dependent and very reliant on how we're received by the groups we belong to. No one makes decisions in isolation. Rather, they assess the social risk of acting in ways that are different from what they've done in the past. So a girl will ask herself, will my friends treat me differently if I do something that is another way than they've done before? Is this different than what I see my mother doing? So social norms, that is what we accept as common ways of doing things, in our social networks influence the systems that are involved with behavior change. So digital information, how we're getting material on our digital devices, might serve as catalysts or at least support mechanisms for attitude and behavior change. But behavioral change requires that individuals have alternatives in choosing and how they might change their behavior. Social norms, the rules we follow in society, may prevent someone from even entertaining a change. And they need to think through, maybe I'm pushing something a little too far. If I want to shift away from the way things have always been done in a group, like a school district or a neighborhood, or even within your extended family, any team is going to have to imagine what will happen to them before they try that change. And anyone who wants to make an intervention but doesn't account for how a social network might put pressure on someone to stay the same is going to have difficulty introducing a change solely through a digital format. When a girl chooses to resist a practice that's strongly associated with what her community thinks is proper, it might even increase rather than reduce harm or violence. So we need to be very careful to assume that behavior change can happen uniformly around the world. Different cultural settings and different contexts may affect girls in different ways. And we're going to talk a little bit more about social norms later on in this presentation.
Thanks, Johnny. So at Girl Effect, we have a really large digital platform called Springster, and it's aimed at mid-adolescent girls in 67 countries around the world. And when we were setting objectives for Springster, we were really interested to find that there was really clear research from the private sector about how to move a user from getting info online to actually making a purchase. But we could find less evidence that would be applicable for the nonprofit sector about using digital in order to encourage a girl in order to have a sensitive conversation with someone offline, for instance. We could find some really interesting emerging learning, and for this next section, we asked New Knowledge to pull the pieces together and to examine the literature and really dig into how digital tools affect behavior change. So the big questions that we were looking at here were, can digital actually bridge the gap between knowledge, attitude, and behavior? Can change objectives on a platform impact behavior change? And how does the digital experience actually transfer to offline behavior change?
Thanks, Casey. And this is where, as a task, it was somewhat challenging for us because there is consistent agreement in the literature that online interventions can produce general behavioral change. But the details of how those changes happen have mostly been stumbled on through trial and error rather than proactive theoretical modeling. It's mostly because digital media wasn't developed for the purpose of changing behaviors. We've just now reached a point where proposed models for interventions can be more carefully designed based on behavioral strivings. So our review of the literature shows that most of the work can be summarized in three ways, starting with the assessment of a target population's desire and needs, engaging digital tools that are fun, and we often hear the term fun, or users' information-seeking strategies. So when we think about behavior change and teens, girls and boys, are wondering about what's happening to their bodies. Their minds are developing at different paces, and these don't always match across groups. What we know online is that these are the stories they seek out. They seek out stories that help them understand better of different ways that they're growing and developing, examples of how others are interacting at their age, in order to understand what might be right for them. It's really a mental process, a thought process, when they look at their seeking behaviors online. And what we know for those successful interventions is when they are structured around those core strivings and desires to know more about who I am and how people might behave like who are experiencing things like me. When we match those needs and desires, we see higher use rates. But more importantly, where we stand right now with the research is that we're able to witness interventions in ways that we haven't seen in the past. Years ago, our theories were based on limited observations, but today, online behavior leaves a trail for researchers. We can see patterns of clicks and comments that can help explain in more detail how users are engaging and acting. And that's something researchers haven't had until recently. So the theory tends to be very recent and very thin. Although the behaviors aren't different, we're seeing a lot more about the seeking behavior. But even with those limitations of the current literature, some studies are beginning to suggest that certain online interactions or social processes can actually build offline agencies, particularly for vulnerable populations. Now, this will come as no surprise, I'm sure, to everyone who's online now, but the online tools and environments that were used by vulnerable populations during the Arab Spring produced a wealth of new understanding about how digital media can be linked to physical consequences. These tools supported consumers' feelings of empowerment and increased a sense of personal agency that each person interacting online could have. They were leveraged to spur an offline behavioral change. It helped connect communities that had traditionally seen themselves as disconnected, and they realized they shared common goals, frustrations, and could work together to create change. Now, that may sound very Pollyanna about what occurred. We think that the scale was the first time we were able to see the digital experience demonstrate how communities came together. We need additional studies, though, to clarify the links and build theories that can explain the detailed process where digital tools shift social norms and build agency in a population toward a positive change that are associated with less conflict-based outcomes and more around inclusive, more community-level engagement. What we've learned, though, from this literature is that there are a number of open questions that we're seeking to answer. The Arab Spring showed that social media can help groups who feel disenfranchised to organize and challenge a norm. There remain a few larger questions that we're hoping to disentangle from some of the data we're now seeing with online platforms. For example, the role of digital in a girl's online behavior in negotiating her growth in an offline social life. We can see it happen with a small intervention, but the literature tends to be a little bit shy and underdeveloped when we look at how it happens across her developmental life cycle. We don't have studies of usership over time. So we know that small behaviors can change, but really it's part of a developmental cycle that can take 10 years. We also know that there are links between the, sorry, I jumped ahead a slide there, everyone. We know that digital can accelerate behavioral change because it allows people to imagine different possible outcomes if they choose to act differently. But today we wonder if the increased availability of information and the models or stories with different outcomes can provide a team with more confidence in how they can choose to behave and interpret reactions they get from an interaction after they've tried a behavior. Building on that point, we still have limited information about how reading more stories about girls like her, our user, and learning how we grow and develop translates into a repeated acceptance of who you are, about how you're thinking or prepare to make changes. The theory talks about how we contemplate understanding our sense of control. And what we're wondering is if we read more stories that look somewhat different and have different outcomes, does the reader start to develop a faster sense of control and ability to make a change or make a tentative change in order to move toward a new behavior? The other challenge we're seeing today is that when we see many voices sharing a similar story, we know that it produces a sense of a social norm, even if that isn't true. We know that the Arab Spring demonstrated the demand for change that emerged from a community, but quite recently, global media has been talking about how these tools have been used for propaganda purposes to suppress behavior. If anything, a new tool like social media is no different than the use of film for propaganda, that the form is established, but there are competing voices in those spaces. And we know that digital media has the power to make changes, but it's the question of weighing counter-programming that we need to take into account. We shouldn't be looking only at our intervention, but how it sits in the context of other interventions targeting similar related behaviors. Which of course means that we're studying the positive examples of digital media, but we're also learning about how misuse or a political purpose can actually create a counter story. The current research does find that repeated direct experience with a specific attitude or reminders about a specific behavior can strengthen the attitude-behavior relationship. And word of mouth really is similar to e-word of mouth. A comment online, a comment on social media is a powerful tool for spreading information in the same way that a conversation is. So some research finds that close, more clustered social networks will facilitate or support behavior changes if there are consistent reinforcing messages in their digital world. These findings reflect those networks that girls already perceive as really relevant to their lives. It's their online circle of friends that they're talking back and forth to, as well as those they talk to in person, that create their understanding of who they want to be. Because teens are moving their locus, their center of focus, from family to people of their same age and in their same network who are offering them acceptance. So we deal with this concept of perceived credibility of the group that says that's good. It's the group comparing notes with what they read online.
Thanks, Johnny. So on Springster, the digital platform I mentioned earlier, we can see evidence of behavior change with girls and with the boys that we have on our platform as well. It's relatively easy to see that emerging impact with those who are commenting, for instance, and those who are completing surveys. But we know that we have a significant number of users who spend a lot of time on the site and read content, but they don't necessarily participate in the same way as the other people do. And so for this next section, we really wanted to dig into what can we learn about these users. And the questions that we had there were, how do we understand impact on the silent consumer, and how do we actually measure behavior change in what we call the silent consumer?
So that was a bit of a double question that we had to answer, and we often hear about the silent consumer referred to in social media as a lurker, but we prefer to think of them as active consumers or users. So when we think of the silent consumer, they are really learning by exploring and may take their information from an online source and share it in other ways, offline or with friends. We think of this use as using information as power. So silent online engagement benefits those who don't post in very valuable ways. We know that they may be more likely to be protecting themselves from risk. They may share their phone and don't want to leave a record or a trace that can be found by other users of that phone, or they may not be ready to add information because they're still in their thinking process. So what we've come to expect is that they may receive different benefits or benefit to different degrees based on how they're traveling through the content and consuming that digital platform. So it's often easy to measure only what people post online and to assume that's representative, and we suggest it is not. We know that a great deal of online content consumption doesn't produce interaction, but we can monitor the click patterns and the frequency of use of an online content, the frequency with which someone goes back and rereads a story to develop mastery of an idea. So with variations in these patterns between those who post and those that don't, we know that the only strategy is to talk to the users who aren't posting about how they're thinking about the process. We don't need a lot of data, but it is important to hear directly from those silent consumers to understand the thought process. Even though measuring behavior change is difficult, self-report measures have frequently been used, and in most cases, this is what we're learning about outcomes. But if we ask the question of how do we go about that research, we really do need different forms of data collection, not just the back-end data, but talking to people who follow those behaviors to hear about their reasons or rationale. So research of users in an online platform might reveal how observing or reading and downloading can help an active user in their personal characteristics. So I'm sort of turning this back to Kesia to offer us some thoughts about what Girl Effect has seen from some of her work.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, I think here what's really interesting for us is the importance of knowing your user. And we know from the qualitative research that we've done with both girls and boys that especially for vulnerable populations around the world, and especially for girls, a lot of girls are using borrowed phones. They don't own their own phone. And so understanding that they don't have continuous access to the phone and they might have just sporadic access and might be very careful about what they're looking on online, and those other characteristics are really important to think about when we're designing the intervention. And that leads us into our next section where we're going to dig into a little bit around the developmental age. So for Girl Effect, we're especially focused on that mid-adolescent stage. And we know from our other research that there are specific stages within the adolescent experience, and there's different characteristics of each of these stages. So given the fact that we are targeting that mid-adolescent stage, we asked New Knowledge to also dig into how should the experience of girls with online tools evolve over time to maximize impact on behavior change.
And this is a fairly large question, so we're summarizing it very simply here, but there is a much deeper literature, and there is a report that you'll be able to download after that delves a little deeper into this topic. But as new users begin to engage with the platform and use the platform, they're likely to encounter peer groups that they may not know are experiencing the same thing until they encounter them in an online experience and start to read and imagine themselves within that group. Teens and adolescents are really involved in a desire for intimacy. They get involved in self-disclosure and want to develop a better understanding through conversations with others. So as we get into the theory, we start recommending that developers consider ways that platforms can safely and effectively facilitate temporary online disclosures and peer interactions, but also ensure that it doesn't become too public so that an adolescent can experiment with how much is the right amount to share before you go too far. Adolescent girls seek out opportunities to navigate and negotiate multiple identities, and digital tools can provide ample space for safe identity exploration if the resources allow them to consider an action and get feedback. So as a girl transitions from adolescence into emerging early adulthood, we recommend from the research that developers consider opportunities for girls to experience digital platforms by taking on leadership roles in creating or curating content so they can understand how their risks might exist in their offline world. In terms of development, peers in the teen years, the importance of peers grows substantially. Self-efficacy and learning social dependence are basic principles of cognitive development that underlie a great deal of adolescent behavior. And these appear to be universal. Analysis of these principles in the context of adolescent communication online demonstrates consistent findings from research that was undertaken before we even had social media. Basically, adolescents are experimenting and getting to know what is right and what's wrong within a social group. They are looking for acceptance and they are looking for feedback to feel that they have done the right thing when they take on or experiment with an identity. And that's occurring both online and offline. The online space can be used to explore really core adolescent developmental tasks. So we talk about identity formation, autonomy, intimacy, and sexuality. These are all central tasks that an adolescent needs to explore as they grow. This is how a youth experience in an online space helps understand how I exist within a peer community and who I might be or choose to be as I grow. So adolescents are increasingly using social network sites to gain information about their offline world. A review of over 1,600 articles about adolescent identity development in peer-reviewed journals, and this is a fairly robust data set that was published between 2010 and 2015, found basically three themes that describe what adolescents are doing online. They're involved in identity exploration. Who am I? How can I present myself as a member of that community? It's a tool where I present myself. So who am I and how do I show who I am to others in order to get feedback? And lastly, it is the requisite social interactions that help them develop their understanding of who they are. It sets the groundwork for how they might then behave offline. So online, teens are negotiating roles, imagining their roles, how girls and boys should be identified, should interact, what is an appropriate behavior. They explore their sense of self in a fictional way in order to then translate it to a real world. And recognizing that identity is, by its very nature, social, what we find even through analysis of Facebook users is that people will tend to want to display what they believe are highly socially desirable characteristics versus the characteristics that reflect how they might actually behave face to face.
Thanks, Johnny. And this takes us to our last section, where Girl Effect is an organization that really seeks to invest in continuous improvement. And so in this last area, we were really interested to find out how could we innovate? What were the opportunities there? And the questions that we had were, what are the opportunities to innovate on the best practice that is emerging? To what extent can online format influence behavior change? And what's that combination of content and format that best influences behavior change?
So we're going to share this part of the presentation, but I wanted to start off with one of our recommendations or thoughts, was that really giving girls an opportunity to author online content will help them not only create and negotiate identity, but also to advocate for their interests and express themselves in ways that may conflict with their offline social norms or expectations. So as a girl engages in online writing as a form of personal exploration or agency, she's also choosing to experiment with an identity that can support her developing self-efficacy or control over who she can choose to be within her community. It's this agentic process that has the potential to increase a girl's self-awareness and to build her confidence to support how she will then choose to act and think once she grows into an older, contributing member of the community and will be able to assess what feedback looks like.
And on Springster, we've really seen the importance of encouragement, and this can be from the moderator to the girls or from the girls to each other, and it's really this building of online voices that can then transfer to the offline space. And we've also seen that when users read stories that relate to but are also slightly challenging their own experience, they're really more likely to engage more and reflect on how the story relates to or reflects or doesn't reflect their own experience. We have an example of a story that's been extremely popular across all 67 countries, and that is Mother at 16, Matriculants at 22. And this life story of a girl who had a very, what is often a common experience of becoming pregnant at an early age, but then sort of taking a new path and becoming a school graduate, has prompted a lot of conversations that have been really powerful within the site as well, and even inspiring offline change from what we can see from our measurement strategies. But the importance of connections can't be overstated, and this has been really a theme that John brought up throughout the presentation as well. And this encouragement to connect with each other, to support each other, to make challenging decisions is so important. And girls have said over and over on the site that from reading about these experiences and from learning all of these new things, they know that they're not alone and that they have the courage to try something new. But always being mindful as well that the people who are silent online might be the population that we're actually benefiting the most. And we're looking forward to continuing to learn how to measure that and learn about those silent consumers. So at this point, I just wanted to pause and then reiterate that the report that we've referred to a few times here is available. You can download it at the URL that you see there. If you have additional questions about the report, please do email us at the email address that you see here. And as we integrate the learnings from the research into our own work, we're continuing to iterate and change and adapt. And please do let us know if you have any reflections on what you're learning in your own experience as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kezia and John, for that great presentation. We'll dive right into some of your questions. We got a couple of questions sort of asking about, whether this, this research and some of this is relevant in developing countries, or whether you sort of presuppose that, these girls are having relatively stable internet connectivity, and how sort of those factors can impact, the effect of these sort of online interactions and interventions in behavior change. So maybe both of you want to speak to that
Yep.
a little bit, but what sort of connectivity issues and implications in places that, and you spoke a little bit to this in talking about, access to cell phones and shared phones, but if you guys could elaborate on that, that would be great.
So I'm going to jump in quickly and then turn to Kezia to talk about the Girl Effect's ability to work in these different communities. For the research that we're talking about, adolescent development, social dependence, interaction, this research is global. It's very consistent across cultures and across groups. The developmental mental process is consistent. So the girls, what they're seeking, what they're talking about, it doesn't matter where they are, what the bandwidth is, or what their connectivity options are. They're still going through the same kind of life-changing process and thinking. But that's where I think the Girl Effect's work has really shown us some very interesting variations. So Kezia, I'll turn that to you.
Sure, yeah. So that was sort of an underlying question that we ourselves had as we began the literature review work with New Knowledge, recognizing that a lot of the literature itself does stem from more developed contexts. And so as we were learning about the findings that New Knowledge then produced in the report, we had the opportunity to reflect on those with the experience that we have with our users on the site. And it was really quite consistent. And one thing that we have found across the board when we think about our users and we think about the role that digital has in their lives is that more and more the role of digital and mobile really does give a sense of social capital to users, and so users often come to the platform itself trying to learn and trying to connect with others in new ways. And this is sort of becoming a global experience, and it's really exciting to be able to observe that and to learn about that from the experience that we're having across our platform. Great.
We have questions as well about sort of the applicability of this research. Obviously, your focus was on adolescents, but sort of how this might apply to adolescent groups, and whether you've sort of identified differences between boys and girls in terms of the way behavior changed through access to digital platforms and digital information.
Adva, I'm not sure I quite heard the question. There was a little bit of feedback.
Sorry about that, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, let me give you the question again. So the question that we got a couple of versions of this question, which is, how does this research apply to adolescent boys or other groups, and whether you've identified differences in the way boys and girls' behavior changes as a result of their interaction with digital information.
Okay, so psychologically, boys and girls are developing their bodies and brains develop at different levels. So there is a growing discordance between onset and puberty between boys and girls, and how they're interacting in terms of their trusted social groups is slightly different. And we do see for women there is a higher level of engagement with peer groups for affirmation, whereas boys may engage in different kind of behaviors to look for affirmation from their dependent groups. Beyond that, really it's pretty consistent. They're looking for people who are going through the same thing they're going through, and boys and girls are obviously negotiating different bodies, so they're having to negotiate in different ways and understand what it means for interaction between the sexes. So understanding those sex questions is a basic essential striving of the teen developmental cycle. I did notice in some of the questions you were asking about our work on this project for Girl Effect was synthesizing the global literature. So our work is pulling from studies that have been done both in developing nations, in Europe, in the United States, but there's also quite a bit of work that's emerged from Southeast Asia and Africa, Latin America. So the findings we're talking about is really a global data set. And we see that the results are fairly consistent in terms of what's going on in kids' lives. A lot of the studies have even been replicated in different countries to see if there are cultural variations. And really the difference is topic and how community addresses the topic. But Kesia, you might want to address some of the work that you guys have been doing and maybe explain that our slides are drawn from Girl Effect's program areas.
Yeah, I think just one thing to add to that is that this is also where it is important to highlight the importance of understanding your potential user, your target user. And I just wanted to give a special mention here to the DIAL Digital Principles for Development, which have been really helpful for us as we develop our platform. And this is one thing that they also mention. But knowing that our target user is often quite socially isolated for a variety of reasons according to different contexts, is something that we see really reflected in the actual change that we've seen exhibited in the space. And by that I mean the connections that our users are making with each other, especially amongst the girl population, seem to be especially transformative. We do have boy users on the site. We have more girls than boys, but we do have a healthy proportion of boys. And the comments that we get from them are mostly about, oh my goodness, this is really new, interesting information, whereas girls seem to value more the ability to learn and to understand that they're not alone in their experience and to connect with others.
Great.
I noticed a question about...
Sure. I was just going to throw a question out there. A couple people asked about sort of measurement. So, how people are measuring, social norms or gender norms, and what kind of evaluations or methodologies have been effective in evaluating behavior change in digital engagement. So I was hoping that John, maybe you could sort of answer that question.
Sure. There's pretty much every social science method in the world, and when we talk about effectiveness, really as social scientists we like to talk about how do we get to the truth. I think one of the challenges that we see as social scientists asked to recommend a method is we tend to describe what we call mixed methods research. So ethnography, telling the story of a small group using a product, tells us a very deep truth about the interactions within a culture. But when we add that to a tracking study that's doing back-end data analysis using a program, there's a program called Silverback, for example, where I can really look at specific users' interaction on a website, that tells me so much more about the truth, and it turns a story from an ethnography into a much deeper understanding of the experience. And one of the challenges we see in the literature is that there tends to be an over-reliance on the survey, the discussion, which is challenging, or even the focus group, which is much more challenging to interpret because of the social constraints around talking about a topic. In some cultures, that's not a problem, but in other cultures, it's a great problem. In some communities, having girls and boys talking in the same room produces a different answer than if they're talking in separate rooms because of the social conventions of what's acceptable. So we really suggest that for any study to be robust and useful, it should combine quantitative and qualitative data using 2 or 3 different qualitative techniques at the same time in order to get the best way of seeing a story from many viewpoints.
Could I just add to that, Adva? So at the Springster experience, we're also really trying to tease out that difference between reach, engagement on the site, which is sort of your engagement with the site itself, and tease that apart from the participation, which might be around the commenting and surveys, and look at these things as a holistic whole as they relate to impact as well. And we've seen real promise in also using traditional evaluative techniques and also thinking about how to use big data, which is especially something to consider for a site like Springster, where we have about 1 million monthly users. And you definitely need to use the big data techniques in order to first of all understand the user experience, but also understand the impact on the users as well.
Great. Kesia, I'm wondering if you can give us an example of how of how, online behavior might translate into offline behavior change, if there are sort of specific examples that you've seen through your work at Girl Effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So we use a mixed methods approach similar to what John was talking about just now in order to evaluate that impact. And so we look at the comments where girls might talk about, oh my goodness, this is a new idea that I had from this article. I'm going to go out and try it. And we also use survey responses as well. But we also complement that with occasionally talking with our users face-to-face in real life in order to sense check all of the data that we're getting offline and understanding more about how that moves into the online experience. And so we found that there's particular potential in using the digital platforms in order to inspire girls to make change in their own lives and in order to help them make connections with others offline as well. And we've had some really powerful examples of a girl, for instance, showing us a savings bank that she went out and obtained because she read an article on Springster about the need to have a receptacle in order to have your savings. And then we also had examples of girls telling us that because I learned from others on the site about others having similar experiences to mine, I learned that I have real value in myself, and I actually started to participate more in class. And other girls were talking about how they had the courage to talk to their auntie or to their mother about some really difficult experiences because of the encouragement that they had from the site as well. I think there's still a lot to learn in this area, and we're also learning about ways to consistently measure this across different platforms and across different countries, but I think there's some really exciting signs there.
Great. We've gotten a couple of questions sort of asking about, the, increasing distrust of online information in some settings, and also some of the potential risks of online information and of social media engagement. And so I guess a couple of questions on that front, which is, how do you think some of this digital engagement can be limiting? In the sense that, it could foster a set of narrower perspectives rather than sort of opening people's minds? And also, how are you sensitizing girls about the risks of manipulation on social media and trying to address some of those potential risk factors?
Mm-hmm. I'll start with this one and then move to John,
Sure.
if you don't mind. We have seen that in a lot of the countries where we work, there is a lot of trust actually for the information that young people read online. They often tend to see that as something that's quite true and quite valid, and might not always be sense checking it. And so we do a lot of content on our site actually about helping girls to sense check the information that they receive online and to validate it and how to move through that online space as well. And so we've seen overall that for young people, the online world is really the first place where they're going for information in many cases. And that's just only increasing, and we're really excited about learning how to effectively meet them in that space on an online platform.
And I think we've had as I was saying earlier about the misuse of data and the function of propaganda, teens are becoming very good editors. The one thing we've noticed from some of the studies we've done in the United States is that younger people really have a fine-tuned skill because they spend a lot of time online. So they are looking at a large wash of material and are sorting out what seems a little bit pushy. I think that it's still a new tool, and so we're still learning its techniques. And I think there's a little bit of blowback right now or negative reaction to some of the negative media that's out there. But I think as teens learn to use material online, start running into stories like the Springster platform that talks about how do I truth check this to see that it makes sense, that's where they start developing their editorial skills. we know that anything that tries to be too overtly manipulative very quickly gets shut down now. So techniques that worked 5 years ago are no longer useful for people in the online media space trying to push something because the team today is a very sophisticated editor.
We've also gotten a couple of questions about the issue of literacy and how much language or English literacy in particular is a barrier or a factor in designing these user interfaces for development interventions, and whether the research shows that icons or pictorial devices are accepted as well. So one of the questions was sort of what insights do you have for sort of user experience design?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to translate content to the local language whenever possible. We certainly do that on Springster, and I know a lot of other really successful sites do that as well. And it's really important as well, again, to think about your user. Think about the way that they currently digest digital information. When you're trying to design a product, look at what they're already looking at online and learn about the types of visuals they're attracted to and the type of iconography and so on, and learn from that when designing your own product as well. It's certainly important for young people especially to have a very visually appealing page and have something that has not only text and making sure that the text is very readable for lower literacy people as well, and then making sure it's really well balanced with images and iconography that illustrates the topics.
And again, we often focus on the individual as if they work in autonomy. And we know about teens specifically that they are also comparing notes, showing one another information, negotiating with one another what it means, and using what they understand or don't understand in a conversation in order to develop their sense of its truth. So we need to consider that the material will not necessarily be solely experienced by one person, but may be part of a much larger dialogue.
Great. We also had another question sort of about measurement, which is how do you translate digital metrics such as reach and interaction on social media channels as a measurement for behavior change?
We do that in several ways, at least in the Springster experience. We think very carefully about this connection between the interactivity someone has on a platform and what that might mean in terms of behavior change. And so I think it's important to think about the metrics that you have available to you with social media in terms of the click-through rates and the dwell times and all of those really exciting new metrics that are kind of coming into the field as well, and using those alongside and integrated with the more traditional impact measurements that we've been accustomed to in the development sector as well. And I think it's also something that we're learning about over time, and as we're learning about how the engagement and participation might link to impact, it's really important to think about the ways to integrate the new metrics with the more traditional metrics, if you will.
Great. I also was hoping, Kezia, that you could tell us a little bit more about how you've sort of applied some of this learning from the literature review in your work at Girl Effect.
Yeah, definitely. So some of the learnings that have come through from the literature review, especially the importance of social connections as a really important way to reach youth and to reach girls, has been really, really important. And we've enhanced actually our emphasis on encouraging conversation within the site and across our other digital platforms as well, in order to facilitate that type of learning. And so that was a really important lesson that we had. Also around the iterative assessments and the feedback, and ensuring that we had really active moderation in our sites as well, in order to, as we saw emerging signs of offline behavior change and girls encouraging each other to have behavior change, really using the input of the moderators in that online experience in order to make the change as well. And we're still learning about those benefits for the silent consumers. We're excited to continue to dive into that topic over the coming months as well.
Great. And now a question for both you and John as we wrap up. If you had to guide people towards sort of 3 key takeaways that they could, apply or use in their programs tomorrow, what would they be?
Casey, do you want me to go first, or do you want?
Sure. Go ahead, John.
Okay. I think we talk about knowledge is socially constructed. Social media is not a universe unto itself, and so I think the big takeaway is that social and digital media are techniques for thinking and contemplating. They are spaces where we interact, but they are so intertwined to the community that we should never look at digital as a standalone experience. It's going to be part of a larger understanding. With that in mind, I think that we need to calm down a bit about the fear of technology causing change, because we are growing into a much more connected world, and that will help people who are at risk be able to see alternative life stories that may help them find paths to success. And I think those are the 2 takeaways that are really valuable from our thinking.
Yeah, and I would also say that that for a young person especially, that real world and online world, it's a seamless place that they live, and I think it's really important to meet them where they are in terms of that experience, and make sure that the content that we have online is really serving their offline needs as well. The importance of connections is so important, and being able to facilitate that, while also recognizing that for a lot of users, observing and learning without necessarily participating is crucially important. So we also need to facilitate that experience as well, and not discount or not disbar those users from the online experience. And I think overall, I just want to reiterate that it's really important to know your user as you're developing your online platform, your digital platform for your user, whether that's an online girl, an online boy, or an adult.
That was well said, Casey.
Great. Well, Casey and John, thank you both so much. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our scheduled time for this webinar. But thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. If you want to watch the webinar again, we will be emailing it to you shortly and posting it on devex.com. So look out for that in the near future. And once again, a big thank you to Casey and John for taking the time to speak with us. If you'd like to learn more about the report, please feel free to send an email to info@girleffect.org. And please remember to join us next week for the second webinar in this series, where we'll dive into the best practices for safeguarding in a digital era. On behalf of DevX, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and hope you'll join us for our next online event.